Yesterday, over the course of my video, I spoke about the way in which the news from the battlefronts, in terms of the economic situation, in terms of Western support, in terms of events, political events in the United States, gets worse for Kiev every day, how there is now a clear trajectory towards eventual defeat, and for the moment at least, an inability either in Ukraine or in the West to try to find alternative routes out of this disaster that is now staring, the Ukrainian leadership is staring at. And in fact, as I discussed yesterday, we've now had an article by Emma Ashford in The Guardian, which basically gives the game away about what Biden administration policy is about at the moment. These attempts to rush aid to Ukraine, to talk about Ukraine going onto the defensive, they're not really long-term plans about Ukraine itself. They are, as she all but admitted, in fact, she even used the word herself, attempts to shift the narrative, to change the talk from Ukrainian victory to one of Ukrainian survival, in order to make it possible for President Biden to avoid a debacle next year and to win the election in November. So essentially, narrative construction as opposed to a real plan for Ukrainian victory. And of course, there is the ongoing political crisis in Kiev. I believe, incidentally, that there is an article in the French media. I haven't actually read it myself, I haven't found it myself, but I believe it is there, it is circulating. I've seen various references to it, that the French media, for one, are now, for the first time, openly talking about a political rift between President Zelensky and General Zelensky, and about the fact that President Zelensky now sees General Zelensky not just as a political rival, but as a political threat. Anyway, the news, needless to say, continues to get bad. It continues to get worse for Ukraine every day. Yesterday, apparently, there was a TV program on Ukrainian television in which a Ukrainian military officer, apparently with the name Green, I'm not familiar with him, but incidentally and for the record, the name Green is not unknown in this part of the world, both in Russia and in Ukraine. But anyway, this Ukrainian officer actually floated the possibility that because of extremely heavy losses, Ukraine might have to abandon all the territorial gains it made over the course of the Kharkiv counteroffensive in the autumn of 2022, that it might have to abandon Kupiansk and Izium and Liman and withdraw to more defendable lines further west. Now that happens, that will be a massive and a very bitter blow for Ukraine. I would say that, from what I can understand, this particular Ukrainian officer is not a major decision maker. But the fact is, he gave this interview. It apparently appeared on Ukrainian television. Ukrainian viewers will have heard it. And I do wonder whether this particular TV interview, which must have infuriated members of President Zelensky's team, whether it isn't another symptom of that ongoing power struggle in Kiev between Zelensky and at least parts of the military. It's worth pointing out that Ukrainian forces in this area, Kupiansk, Liman, Izium, appear to be commanded by General Syrski, who is General Zelensky's military rival, and perhaps General Syrski is also a political ally of President Zelensky. There are some rumors that President Zelensky is now, when he manages finally to sack General Zelensky, if he ever succeeds in doing that, that he's now again thinking of appointing General Syrski to take General Zelensky's place. And it could be that this interview is intended to undermine General Syrski's reputation by signaling to Ukrainians that his management of the military situation on the northern front isn't that actually that good, and that the entire offensive that was carried out last autumn in Kharkiv region, that all its gains are about to be lost, and that General Syrski is ultimately the person responsible. If that's correct, then Mr. Green is presumably acting on General Zelensky's behalf. But anyway, let's put all those speculations aside. These speculations, I should say, are well-founded. We have seen lots of media sniping of this kind going on in Ukraine over the last couple of weeks. But let's put aside the question of what Mr. Green's precise motives are, what the motives of the television station that broadcast these comments is. Let's note the fact that at least one Ukrainian officer, middle-ranking officer, is now appearing on Ukrainian television and talking about a major retreat from Ukraine in the north, one that sacrifices all the gains that Ukraine achieved at such enormous cost in its Kharkiv offensive last autumn. Anyway, it could be that it's because of all of this swirling, deteriorating situation in Kiev, the economic fears, the worries about potential hyperinflation, all of that I was talking about. It could be that this is the reason why President Zelensky has now chosen to go on a trip, a long-distance trip. He apparently took his jet, flew first to the Cape Verde Islands, where he had a meeting with the president of that country. I'm not quite sure what the purpose of that meeting was, but maybe it was intended as a stopover for his aircraft to refuel. And then he flew on to Argentina, where he intends to attend the inauguration of Argentina's newly elected president, President Milei. President Milei has been an outspoken supporter of Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. So maybe that is why, there are some reasons for this trip, but it still seems a strange thing to do at a time when there is a crisis in Kiev. But of course, strange it may look to an outside observer who might say that it makes more sense, given that there is a crisis, for the man supposedly in charge to stay in post and deal with the crisis there. But of course, if you're Zelensky, it might be a relief to get away from Kiev, and perhaps it might also, at this particular moment in time, be good for his health. Anyway, let's turn relatively briefly, to the situation on the battlefronts. Now, there's been a cascade of news, always difficult for someone like myself to assess, by the way. Not all the reports are fully consistent with each other. For example, there are reports about the fighting near Avdeyevka, in that village, Stepovoye, which the Russians have been pushing towards for several weeks now, with Berdichi lying beyond that. There have been reports from Russian sources that they do in fact still have a presence in Stepovoye. Others, like Dima at the Military Summary channel, appear to believe otherwise. My own view is that there is, as I've said already, a very, very tough encounter battle going on for that particular village, that Russian attacks in this area are pretty much continuous, and there's been a fascinating report about this by Maxim Tucker at the London Times. Now, this report by Maxim Tucker essentially tells us the same story that we heard about 2 weeks ago from El País. El País gave its account of the nature of the fighting that's going on around Stepovoye, west of the railway track, northwest of Avdeyevka, and spoke with soldiers of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which is the force that is now trying to defend Stepovoye and trying to keep the Russians from advancing west beyond the railway track. And Maxim Tucker essentially repeats that whole exercise. He too goes to the same area. He too speaks with essentially these same soldiers, or at least also soldiers, from the 47th Mechanized Brigade. And he hears many of the same things. He hears, first of all, that they're very low in ammunition, that they're only able to fire around 5 rounds of ammunition a day. Their artillery units are only able to fire around 5 rounds of ammunition a day. That on this occasion, this particular article tells us that the soldiers who are operating these guns are complaining not only that they are desperately short of ammunition, but that much of the ammunition that they're getting is of extremely poor quality, that it comes now from a variety of sources. When the Americans were supplying ammunition, or perhaps the South Koreans were supplying ammunition, it was all of high quality and uniform. Now they're getting bits and bobs of 155 millimeter ammunition from various sources. It's not always identical. Some of the shells are outright duds. And the result is that not only do they have very few shells to work with, but the shells that they do have don't always work properly. So that was one thing. He also confirmed that the Ukrainians are suffering very heavy losses in trying to defend Stepovoye. Of course, they claim that they're inflicting very heavy losses on the Russians, but he did say that there are M113 tracked vehicles, ambulances constantly ferrying wounded Ukrainian soldiers to the rear as the situation becomes, as losses build up and accumulate. And then he talks also, and this is in some ways the most interesting part of the article, about the devastating effect for Ukraine if Avdeyevka is lost. The war in Ukraine is at a critical moment. The fall of Avdeyevka would mean Ukrainian forces fall back to the reservoirs of Karlovka and the heights of Ocheretine. Karlovka supplies water to the remaining Ukrainian-held territory in the Donbass, with any battle there severely disrupting its flow. Seizing the heights at Ocheretine 2 miles away, would allow the Russians to begin razing Mirnograd, a city of 50,000 people. Unless the West provides brigades like the 47th with ammunition, they will be unable to stop Putin's troops. The Russians could run onto Dnipro, that's the city the Russians call Dnipropetrovsk. This is with a population of 1 million, and sweep north towards Kiev, cutting off Ukraine's army in the Donbass. Holding Avdeyevka is also key to maintaining morale. Its defense is a tribute to the thousands of soldiers who've died there since Russia's hybrid invasion of 2014. And the Ukrainian positions here are a dagger at the throat of the occupied city of Donetsk, which is central to any future Ukrainian counteroffensive to recover the Donbass region. So what we are told is that this is a crucially important town. Of the Ukrainians cannot afford to lose Avdeyevka. If they lose Avdeyevka, in effect, they will lose the whole war. Now, I don't know whether any of this is true. Perhaps it is, perhaps it's not. But this is something that is being claimed now by the London Times. When Avdeyevka falls, as it will, I will be interested to see whether people like Maxim Tucker and other people in the Western media walk this back. For the record, the reports I'm hearing at the moment is that Avdeyevka is once again coming under increasing pressure, that the Russians are now renewing their attacks in the Stepovoye Berdichi area, in other words, in precisely the area where the 47th Mechanized Brigade is located. And at the same time, they are pushing hard from the northern areas closer to Avdeyevka towards the through the industrial zone, through this famous coke plant that is located close to Avdeyevka, and also from the south. And all of this is putting the soldiers of Ukraine's 110th Brigade, who are the ones who are actually defending Avdeyevka itself, under almost intolerable pressure. And it seems that the Russians, having redeployed and reorganized their forces and perhaps used bad weather conditions as cover to do that, are now renewing their assault on Avdeyevka itself. Going back to that article by Maxim Tucker, note the point that he makes, that unless the West provides brigades like the 47th with ammunition, they will be unable to stop Putin's troops. But, as I and so many others have been pointing out, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas especially so, supplies of ammunition are now running short. The European Union has been unable to increase ammunition production. I'm getting very contradictory reports about the state of ammunition production in the United States. Brian Beletic, in one of his recent programs at the New Atlas, spoke about increases, planned increases, in ammunition production in the United States. That the United States, I understand, is supposedly now producing around 40,000 shells a day. But I've seen other reports from other places, from other, and this is based on comments by a US official, but I've seen other stray reports appearing in all sorts of other places, that ammunition production in the United States is actually at around 28,000 and a month. And as Brian Beletic correctly pointed out, some of the plans for increases in ammunition production that this US official were talking about depend upon Congress providing funding. And of course, there are at the moment problems with that. And anyway, for the United States to reach its goal of producing over 1 million shells a year. That would, even according to this US official, take a significant amount of time. We are some years away from achieving that goal. Now, as I said, I've heard other completely contradictory figures about actual US production, which is lower, significantly lower than these claims. And I'm going to suggest what the probable explanation is, which is that, as anybody who's familiar with industrial processes knows, industrial production is never a smooth curve. There are rises and falls, sometimes seasonal ones, sometimes based on supplies from subcomponent manufacturers, in the case of steel production, steel manufacturers, chemical manufacturers, people of that kind. There's also effects of breakdown of machinery, and the pictures I've seen of the factory where most of these shells are produced suggests that some of the machinery now is quite old and might require maintenance from time to time. And of course, there's also the seasonal factors that I spoke about. In autumn, for example, people sometimes get ill with colds and flus. If there's a cold epidemic or a flu epidemic amongst what is apparently a relatively small workforce, then many of them might be off sick, and that will affect production. This thing, anybody who has had any familiarity with industry, this sort of thing happens all the time. It's not unusual. It's something one factors in terms of industrial process, that sometimes on one particular month, production might be much higher than in another month. Sometimes in a month where production is very low, because, for example, much of the workforce is ill and taking time off to recover from a flu or cold epidemic. That means that supplies to the factory increase and pile up, and that means that the following month production actually surges and goes higher than is the case normally. So you get this sort of fluctuation in production figures. And I do wonder whether this US official, when she was quoted about giving certain figures for production, which are much higher than other figures, whether she might be citing production figures for months when production was particularly high and ignoring those when production was much lower, and whether some of the very low figures, much lower figures that I'm also hearing, might be, on the contrary, people citing months when production numbers were exceptionally low, and discounting the fact that in other months production can be higher. By the way, in contrast to the United States, Russia has many factories, several factories, that produce shells, and that, of course, to some extent at least, smooths out these imbalances. It seems that in the United States, production is largely centered on one factory, which anybody who understands industrial process will know is in itself a logistical problem. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time about this, but going back to Maxim Tucker's article, the reality is something which Maxim Tucker perhaps isn't aware of. The reality is that the Western powers cannot provide brigades like the 47th Brigade with the ammunition that the 47th Brigade is saying it needs. The men of the 47th Brigade contrast the enormous number of shells that they had in the summer, how they were able to fire 150 shells a day, and compare it with the 5 shells, many of them substandard, that they can use on any particular day. Now, what Maxim Tucker and those soldiers probably do not know is how difficult it was for the United States to cobble together the hundreds of thousands of shells which Ukraine was supplied with for its offensive last summer. As I've discussed in several programs, hundreds of thousands of these shells had to be sourced in South Korea, and it's most unlikely now that the South Koreans will be supplying more shells, especially as they're becoming increasingly concerned about the growing rapprochement between the North Koreans and the Russians. So this thing that Maxim Tucker is talking about, the Western powers suddenly ending Ukraine's ammunition problems, it's not going to happen in any remotely acceptable time frame for Ukraine. It might not actually even happen at all. In which case, according to Maxim Tucker's own logic, the Russians will take Avdeyevka, and they won't just take Avdeyevka. The Ukrainians will be unable to stop them advancing further, and they would move on to Karlovka, possibly Ocheretine, and conceivably Dnipro itself. I think here Maxim Tucker has slightly misunderstood things. I don't think that, for the moment at least, the Russians would plan to storm Dnipro itself, a city of 1 million people, located on the west bank, principally on the west bank of the Dnieper River. But I can imagine how the Russians might, in that case, advance north up the river, doing exactly what he talks about, cutting off Ukrainian forces located on the east bank of the river in Donbass, and conceivably in Kharkiv region as well. But that's all very much for the maybe not so distant future. But let's not run ahead of ourselves. These are big operations, and we don't know whether they will take place for the moment. But anyway, this is a point I wanted to make about this particular article. What Maxim Tucker, perhaps not understanding, is telling us in this article is that Ukraine is on the brink of losing the war. It will not be able to hold on to Avdeyevka. It will not get from the West the ammunition it needs. The Russians will take Avdeyevka. They will, at some point, no doubt, reach the Dnieper River here in central Ukraine, and then at that point, the situation for Ukraine will become existential. But anyway, that's Maxim Tucker. We've had other news from other places. In particular, it does seem as if the Russians are pushing now much harder in the Liman area. They seem to have a habit of adjusting their advances between Liman and Kupiansk, depending on where the Ukrainian defenses are strongest. But the big advances that the Russians appear to be making at the moment are around Bakhmut, and there are more reports, steadily more reports, that the Russians are now on the brink of launching an attack to capture Bogdanovka itself. And as I said, if Bogdanovka falls, then it seems to me from my inexpert view, looking at a map, that the Ukrainians would have to withdraw, in that case, from Ivanyivska, and whether they would be able to defend Chasov Yar, I think is debatable, and that would bring the Russians to a canal in that area, and then, of course, I suspect the Russians would pause and review their options. So a grim situation for Ukraine on the battlefields. And we are getting more reports about what has happened in Congress. I said yesterday that the Republican positions hardened over the course of last week. There's now been a report in the New York Times about how President Biden's comments to the Congress people, the Republican Congress people, apparently hardened their stance even more. There's another article in the US media, I think it's the Washington Post, I might be wrong, which says that the Biden administration made a major mistake linking aid to Ukraine with the immigration issue. And that what then happened is that the Biden administration found itself facing demands from the Republicans, from Mike Johnson, for far more to be done in terms of the immigration issue than it could possibly concede, and that put the whole situation in terms of aid for Ukraine in potential jeopardy. Now, of course, all of this is true, but I do want to make an observation here that this is to some extent an argument from hindsight, because when President Biden did link aid for Ukraine with aid for Israel and Taiwan and for funding on the border, the situation probably looked quite different. At that time, the administration may have calculated that there was a clear majority in Congress, a significant majority in Congress, including on the part of Republicans, for aid for Ukraine, and that lumping together all these different aid packages and throwing in some money for immigration might actually make it easier for some Republicans to break ranks and to move over and to back the aid request for Ukraine. What the Biden administration, where the Biden administration miscalculated, where I think a great many people miscalculated, is that they didn't understand the nature of the political battle which has been taking place within the Republican Party, and the fact that the populist wing of the Republican Party is now steadily winning that battle against the establishment group led by Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and Mitt Romney. And it's easy to see how that mistake could have been made in October when the administration put together this package. But of course, as events have turned out, it's turned out badly for them in consequence. Now, as I said in my program yesterday, it's just possible that things could be turned round in Congress over the next 5 days. Congress rises on Friday, next Friday, for the Christmas and New Year vacation. It meets again, it convenes in January. However, it seems that the docket is full. It's unlikely that Congress will return to the topic of Ukraine before February. And of course, if there's a continuing deterioration of the situation in Ukraine, by February, then Ukraine will start to look like a lost cause. And at that point, it might be even more difficult to persuade the Republicans to change their stance. So we are now looking for the first time at a possibility, I'm not going to put it higher than that, of American aid, military aid and financial aid to Ukraine ending finally once and for all this December. I should say that those who are familiar with these things, with history, and remember what happened in the last stages of the Vietnam War, will remember that exactly the same thing happened over the course of the fighting in Vietnam. As American troops began to withdraw from Vietnam, so it became harder and harder for the Nixon administration to persuade Congress to continue to provide financial and military aid to the South Vietnamese government. And that triggered growing demoralization within South Vietnam itself, growing political conflict within South Vietnam. And it also, by the way, made it more difficult for the South Vietnamese government to recruit soldiers. Many South Vietnamese men, they'd never been particularly enthusiastic about joining the South Vietnamese army in the first place, but they became even more reluctant to do so, saying why should they risk their lives for a corrupt and incompetent South Vietnamese government, one which, consequent upon the denial of US aid, was looking increasingly likely to lose the war. And I'm starting to see some reports, again, in the American media. There's an article about this on the Washington Post, which suggests that the same dynamic is now starting to appear in Ukraine. As I discussed in a recent program, President Zelensky has not announced his mobilization decree. There are more and more reports coming from Ukrainian officials that recruitment levels have collapsed, that it's been proving all but impossible for the Ukrainian military to find men and even women prepared to sign up to join the Ukrainian army in this situation. And we're starting to read of interviews of young Ukrainians saying that they don't want to sign up, they don't want to join the military. Why should they join the military? To defend a government that is corrupt and incompetent. And those sort of comments from young Ukrainians are now starting to appear in the American media. And I can actually remember almost identical sentiments being expressed in South Vietnam to US reporters from South Vietnamese civilians, men in South Vietnam, in the early 1970s, as the war there began to move towards its inevitable conclusion, which was a North Vietnamese victory. So, a very difficult situation for President Zelensky. And I noticed that increasingly we're starting to see agitated, panic-stricken articles about this, about the deteriorating crisis in Ukraine, starting to appear in the British and other media. And this article is in the Daily Telegraph, and it's by Daniel Hannan. Daniel Hannan is a arch neocon. He is somebody who, not just a few weeks ago, was writing articles in the Daily Telegraph, which basically called for the breakup of Russia. Well, didn't basically, called for the breakup of Russia. It spoke about recreating a state of Muscovy, incorporating Moscow and St. Petersburg, with all the rest of Russia apparently broken and split away. But it's important to say about Daniel Hannan that despite being very much of a neocon, he's also somebody who has been, in my experience, fairly well connected in terms of British political circles. He certainly represents or is widely listened to and heeded by a particular faction within the current British Conservative Party and government. And though I disagree with him on pretty much everything, he has also struck me as being one of the more intelligent people within what might be described as the British neocon establishment. Anyway, he says that Putin's Russia is closing in on a devastating victory. Europe's foundations are trembling, and that he has the courage to go on to say, Kiev's counter-offensive has ended in failure. He doesn't use the word defeat, which is what it was, not in this subtitle, but that's what he says in his subtitle in the article. And then he goes on to say this could be NATO's Suez moment. And he then goes on to say that Ukraine's counteroffensive has failed, and as exhausted Ukrainians fall back from Russia's ramparts and minefields, the initiative is swinging to the invaders. Russia is advancing through the skeletal remains of what used to be Marinka, a city in Donetsk. Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenska, has taken to the BBC to warn that her country is in mortal danger. And then he makes all kinds of claims comparing the war to the First World War, which I think that is, by the way, an inaccurate comparison, but I'm not going to dwell on it. And he talks about how the demographic advantage is with Russia, whose population is 3.25 times the size of Ukraine's. And then he says that Russia has switched a third of its pre-war civilian production to weapons and ammunition. That is absolutely and completely wrong. I don't know where Daniel Hannan has got that claim. But anyway, he then goes on to say that Russia may now have the edge when it comes to drones, the modern equivalent of barbed wire and machine guns. And he then makes it fairly clear that the Russians have the advantage. He admits that he was wrong about the prospect of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. He says, I was one of those who expected Ukraine to break through to the Sea of Azov. Why did I get it wrong? And he then has to acknowledge the truth that the Russians outfought the Ukrainians, which is the point I made yesterday. The invaders, he means the Russians, learnt from their earlier mistakes, whilst Ukraine rushed to train its men in how to operate their new weapons last spring. Russia seeded mile after mile of landmines, built fortifications, dug trenches, and amassed drones. And then he goes on to admit that Putin is winning the diplomatic war. He's able now to visit, well, he put it like that, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and he says that we risk a Suez-like disaster for Western democracies. Any deal that rewards Russian aggression will signal to the rest of the world that NATO, with all its collective wealth and weaponry, could not succeed in the minimal goal of rescuing a country that its two most powerful members, the US and the UK, had undertaken to protect. Now, that, I think, the last is an accurate point. Daniel Hannan, as I said, is an intelligent man. He acknowledges, for example, later in the article, that Ukraine is not a proper functioning democracy. He admits that he made mistakes, as we see. He also acknowledges that there could still be a peace deal, though the terms of the peace deal that he's talking about is one that would certainly be unacceptable to the Russians, but he's essentially acknowledging that there would be a peace deal. And he's not one of those people who's coming up with the ridiculous talk of the Russians after a victory in Ukraine, advancing into Europe, seizing territory and conquering Europe and doing all of those kind of things. So he's intelligent enough not to fall for all of those myths. But he does acknowledge that a geopolitical disaster is looming. And his point that if NATO, with all its collective wealth and weaponry, could not succeed in the minimal goal of rescuing a country that its two most powerful members, the US and UK, had undertaken to protect, then there will be a crisis of confidence in NATO. And I think about that, he's absolutely right. The United States, NATO, the collective West, will have suffered a major blow to their collective prestige. But this is an outcome that we have been warning about on the Duran for years. My colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, put it best when he said years ago that Ukraine, a place where Barack Obama, way back in 2016, said in an interview to The Atlantic, the Russians will always have escalatory dominance. Ukraine was a bizarre place for NATO to make its stand on. But that is what they chose to do. Daniel Hannan was one of the people who wanted it. He indulged in his appalling fantasies of breaking up Russia. And we see that what he has instead is a geopolitical disaster on his hands. I could say that it serves him right, and perhaps it does, but of course, tens of thousands of people have had to pay the price for his miscalculation. And he goes on to say that if Russia ends up annexing land by force, it is not just the West that will lose, it is the entire post-1945 international order. The world is getting colder, the nights are drawing in, all very ominous and, dare I say it, pretentious, but there we are. If this is a geopolitical disaster, then I think Mr. Hannan needs to acknowledge the fact that people like him have played the critical role in bringing it about. They massively underestimated the Russians. They sought geopolitical projects in Russia based on Zbigniew Brzezinski's infamous book about the Grand Chessboard, one which, by the way, Brzezinski himself effectively repudiated. They played an incredibly high-stakes game, and all the indications are that they're about to lose, and at least Daniel Hannan has the courage to admit the fact. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say about Ukraine today. I'm now going to turn to the situation in the Middle East in respect of the situation in Gaza. Now, the first thing to say is that the key event, apart from the ongoing fighting in Gaza, which is terrible, was the event that took place in the Security Council the other day, when, at the prompting of the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, the UAE proposed a draft resolution to the UN Security Council, which was co-sponsored by around 100 states, and which the United States was alone in voting against and vetoing. Now, there's two things to say about this. Firstly, it is clear that the United States, for the first time for many, many years, finds itself in conflict with the UN Secretariat and with the entire UN bureaucracy. Basically, after Kofi Annan ceased to be Secretary General, the United States, which had been working incredibly hard, even during the 1990s, to bring the UN Secretariat into alignment with itself, renewed and redoubled its efforts, and it's been fair to say for some time that the UN Secretariat has essentially aligned itself over the last couple of years closely with the United States. When you see US officials take particular positions on international questions, the UN Secretariat tends to echo what the US generally says. Now, it is clear that it is not just Guterres who is now incredibly angry with the stance that the United States is taking over the Gaza crisis. And since the vote in the Security Council, Guterres has been busy. He's been making comments on X. He's been making it increasingly clear that he is deeply frustrated and very angry by the stance the US took in the Security Council. It's clear, however, that Guterres is not acting alone, that his views are widely shared. In fact, they are supported right across the entire UN Secretariat. And that is most interesting, and that's very remarkable. Bear in mind, many of the members of the UN Secretariat are ex-Western officials. The United States, to a great extent, funds the United Nations and, by extension, its Secretariat. And, of course, the Secretariat is based in the United States. So it's not surprising that the United States historically has had predominant influence within the UN Secretariat. But there is one straightforward reason, going beyond whatever revulsion US officials might feel about the humanitarian catastrophe playing out in Gaza. And of course, many of these officials are indeed shocked by the events in Gaza. But there is another specific factor which is at play, which is that it seems that 130 UN workers, some of them apparently quite senior people, have also died in Gaza over the last few weeks, even as Israeli bombing and fighting in Gaza has been underway. Now, one of my friends, I've actually lost contact with him but some time ago, but one of my friends is in fact, I should say, a UN official. He is a member of the Secretariat. He's worked in various UN agencies, in various parts of the world, primarily the Congo, but in other places as well. And anyway, as a result of my interactions with him in the past, I learned a few things about the kind of sentiments one gets within the UN bodies, the permanent bodies, the UN bureaucracy. And of course, and unsurprisingly, the one thing that the bureaucracy collectively feels, and it's important to say, it is not that large at the senior levels. They all know each other. The one thing that shocks them is when their people die, when their people are killed. And when one gets reports from Guterres that 130 of them have been killed, and that this is the biggest level of loss, apparently, that the UN has suffered, this is what I understood him to say, has suffered in its history, then it does not surprise me that this has crystallized and hardened opinion across the entire UN bureaucracy and turned it not so much against Israel, though no doubt they are furious with Israel, but principally against the United States, which they see as facilitating the war that is taking place in Gaza. Now, many people are going to ask, why does this matter? It is, after all, just a bureaucracy. And what real influence do bureaucracies have? Bureaucracies, in fact, have a great deal of influence indeed. One of the reasons why the EU and NATO have pursued EU and NATO expansion so relentlessly in the last 30 years is precisely because the NATO and EU bureaucracies in Brussels back NATO expansion. It's very difficult in the face of the pressure from these bureaucracies, from Western political leaders, to argue against NATO expansion, given that it's the bureaucracies that set up the meetings, prepare the agendas, do all the work involved, and who have all the various structures and subcommittees that and think tanks and all of those kind of things that produce the messaging. And the same also applies to the UN. And for example, if we talk about organizations like the International Criminal Court, it's not exactly a UN body, but it is very intimately interconnected with it. And it's not inconceivable that the anger of the bureaucracy in New York will start to weigh on decisions made in The Hague by the International Criminal Court. And you will start to see other UN bodies start to follow similar lines. And that will shape the agendas at meetings and in General Assembly meetings and Security Council meetings, but also meetings at lower level bodies, the UN Human Rights Council and the others, certainly over the next few weeks and months, so long as this conflict in Gaza continues. But anyway, that's only one thing. The other thing that has happened is that it is now obvious to me that Putin's visit to the UAE and to Saudi Arabia and Iran, well, not Iran, his meeting with the president of Iran, was centered around discussion of this particular resolution. Now, Putin went to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE. And he met with Raisi in Moscow. And they didn't just discuss Gaza. There are a lot of things on the agenda. As I've already discussed, over the course of this visit, Putin brought various top officials with him, industry officials, finance officials, central bank chair Elvira Nabiullina was there, for example. What clearly happened, however, was that there was a particular urgency in having all of these various leaders, MBS, the president of the UAE being the country that was proposing this resolution to the Security Council, the Iranians and the Russians. It was important to have them all together, talking about this, consulting and speaking with each other and planning their strategy at the Security Council. But that also created the opportunity to talk over many other things that were on the agenda also, such as financial integration, the new BRICS trading and financial system. And note that this visit by Putin to the Arab states, to the UAE and to Saudi Arabia, appears to have been arranged. Well, it was announced very suddenly. And though clearly the organization of this trip some kind of trip of this nature must have been in the works for some time, it is clear to me that it was brought forward in light of the Security Council meeting that the Arab states, the Iranians, all knew was coming. And there is a very simple reason why MBS, Putin, Raisi, the president of the UAE, would want to confer with Putin in person rather than virtually. Because if they're going to be discussing strategy at the Security Council, they probably would not want to talk about it on the phone or through some other virtual format, because nowadays one can never be entirely sure who is listening in on conversations. And it therefore becomes a very good idea for leaders to meet in person, to meet in secure rooms, in secure settings, and to talk together and work out their strategies at the UN together. And of course, one of the people who accompanied Putin was his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov is a former Russian UN ambassador to the UN. He is very familiar with the organization and procedure of the UN and the Security Council, probably more so than pretty much anybody else on the planet. And of course, he would have been there to offer advice and to plan the way forward. And the interesting thing again is that even as these discussions worked out and the plan forward, the plan for the Security Council meeting and for the proposal of the draft resolution would have been hammered out in these various meetings. The other interesting thing is that the Russians and the Arab states were very, very careful to downplay the importance of the events in Gaza in these discussions and to avoid in their various readouts specific reference to the fact that the resolution that was proposed to the Security Council was being prepared and the various diplomatic steps that would have been taken to maximize support for it. There was one clue about what was discussed. And it was picked up by John Helmer in an article he's written with Dancing with Bears. Because over the course of Putin's meeting with the Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi, in Moscow, Raisi specifically brought up the topic of the subject of Gaza. He made certain very, very critical points about Israeli conduct there. And as Helmer correctly says, Putin seemed to agree with what Raisi said, but evaded the issue. Now, evaded discussing the issue. Now, I think that the reason we have these words cited in the Kremlin readout, we actually have a Kremlin readout which cites this very brief exchange between Putin and Raisi, is because this discussion took place. It was apparently filmed and televised, and given that Russian viewers would have been able to see Raisi say these things and would have been able to see and hear Putin's response, it would have been more difficult for the Kremlin to suppress the fact that this exchange took place, and so they published it. They published the words, the brief words, in the readout. Now, what this tells us is two things. Firstly, once again, it demonstrates the extent to which the BRICS states, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, are either actual members of the BRICS, which is what Russia is, and or will become members of the BRICS very soon, as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran will in just a few weeks. It shows the extent of the diplomatic coordination that is now taking place between them. But it also further shows the extent to which this crisis in Gaza is acting as a catalyst, accelerating the integration processes within the BRICS. Because, as I said, in order to agree their various strategies at the Security Council and their diplomatic strategies together, Putin had to meet with all of these people. So he went to the UAE, he went to Saudi Arabia. He apparently considered stopping off in Tehran. This is a somewhat intriguing aspect of the matter, but he disclosed the fact also in that conversation with Raisi. But apparently he decided not to, since he was going to meet Raisi in Moscow anyway. I wonder whether possibly the Russians might have been considering a possible meeting between Putin and Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. This is a guess, and I can't speak to it. But anyway, because all of these leaders essentially had to meet together, they were able to do and found a common position with respect to the Security Council. They were also able to move forward with all the other parts of their agenda on finance and trade and such other things. So the Gaza crisis, in effect, is acting as a catalyst. It is both accelerating the process of BRICS consolidation and integration, even as it is enabling the BRICS to coordinate the sponsorship, the gathering together of more and more countries in advance of whatever will be the next move in the United Nations. Now, note again the point disclosed by the Emirati ambassador to the UN Security Council. 97 states co-sponsored the resolution that the UAE proposed to the UN Security Council. And this was all done within 24 hours. Now, the Emirati ambassador gave the impression that this was all spontaneous. Things like that, in my experience, do not happen spontaneously. What is clear is that over the last couple of days, probably ever since the ceasefire broke down and Israel resumed its military campaign in Gaza, the BRICS states have been quietly working on this resolution, and they will have been lobbying. And we don't know exactly the mechanics of this. They will have been lobbying various states within the UN, states around the world, to come together and to support this resolution. Governments around the world will have been shown drafts of this resolution by presumably Emirati ambassadors. They will have known about this draft before it was published, and the core BRICS states will have been working together to compare notes, to work out what various states would want to see in a resolution like this. The Saudis will have stronger contacts, for example, with some of the Islamic states in Africa. The Emiratis might have knowledge about some of the Pacific states, Indonesia, for example. The Russians will have all kinds of contacts of their own. They'll have been able to come together and craft this resolution together, and they'll have shown the draft to all of these governments, and they'll have put it together, presented it to the Security Council, and provided the Americans with less time to respond. We're going to see much more of this happen over the next few weeks and months, and it will go on happening for as long as this Gaza crisis continues. And in the US's interests, it is essential that it cease to happen for very much longer, that the Gaza crisis be brought to an end sooner rather than later. Because the more these various BRICS states work with each other, the more accustomed to working with each other they will become. The more the ambassadors and the foreign ministers and the diplomats of these states will get to know each other and trust each other and understand how each of them works, the more the leaders will gradually get to know the minds of the other leaders in the BRICS group. Over time, the more coordination takes place, the smoother and better the coordination becomes. And I would have thought it would be in American interests not to see that happen. But anyway, there we are. We see that the Biden, Sullivan, Blinken axis seem either oblivious to all of this or unable to do anything to prevent it. Now, that leads to the probability that we are going to see more moves in the United Nations. And the BRICS now have the UN bureaucracy, to which they're, by the way, also speaking, aligning increasingly with them. Over the next few weeks, we will see what further steps are taken there. And I'm not going to try to anticipate what we're going to see. But already the United States was left looking isolated on the Security Council, criticized by the UN Secretary General and the UN Secretariat, and there'll be more pressure on some of its allies as well. And I would say again that with every day that passes, the damage becomes greater, the political opposition becomes stronger. But there is something else I now want to talk about, and it's not specifically about this BRICS operation that I've spoken about, which we saw how it played out at the Security Council. There is a very interesting situation which has arisen between China and the United States, and I should say that it's been pointed out to me by a member of the Duran community, a person who has been very active in keeping me informed about China-US developments. I'm not going to mention this person's name, though I have mentioned it in the past. I haven't asked her whether I can, so I won't. But anyway, to move on. The point is that we have had two very discordant explanations or readouts of a conversation which took place on the 6th of December between the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and the US Secretary of State Tony Blinken. The American readout about all of this is very brief. It reads, the Secretary discussed his recent travel in the Middle East and US diplomatic efforts in the region. The Secretary reiterated the imperative of all parties working to prevent the conflict from spreading. The Secretary underscored that the recent Houthi attacks against commercial vessels in the Red Sea pose an unacceptable threat to maritime security and international law that all nations have an obligation to uphold. And then there's a brief reference to the fact that the US and China must build on the progress achieved in the recent summit between President Biden and President Xi at the Philofi Ranch near San Francisco a few weeks ago, a short time ago. So that's the American readout, very short, and it gives one the impression that the entire discussion was about Blinken's trip to the Middle East and about the steps that the United States is taking to contain the crisis in the Middle East. The Chinese readout is profoundly different. The Chinese readout does acknowledge that there was a discussion about the crisis in Gaza, about the fact it does acknowledge that President Blinken, Secretary Blinken did provide certain views about the situation in the Middle East. He supposedly recommitted the United States to the two-state solution and all that. But the first part of the Chinese readout, and in fact the key part of the Chinese readout, following Wang Yi referencing the death of Henry Kissinger and the wise approach that Henry Kissinger, according to the Chinese, brought to the conduct of US-Chinese relations. The key point for the Chinese was moving forward, trying to take steps to bring US-Chinese relations onto a different track from the one that they have been following in recent years. And this is what the Chinese readout says. Wang Yi said that President Xi Jinping and President Biden successfully met in San Francisco and determined the San Francisco vision for the future, which is a milestone significance. The important task for both sides at present is to continue the positive effects of the San Francisco meeting, implement the consensus reached by the two heads of state, consolidate the momentum of stabilization of Sino-US relations, and promote the improvement and development of Sino-US relations in a healthy, stable, and sustainable direction. The key word here is sustainable. This is the common interest of China and the United States, and it is also the responsibility of the two major countries. And then, the next paragraph, Wang Yi once again emphasized China's solemn stance on the Taiwan issue and demanded that the United States not interfere in China's internal affairs and not support or condone any Taiwan independence forces. Note that the American readout says nothing about Taiwan. So, already, just a few weeks after the Philofi summit, the one in San Francisco, we see that the apparent consensus, such as it was, that the Americans and the Chinese reputedly reached there, is already cracking. The Americans and the Chinese talk to each other. The Americans want to talk about the Middle East. The Chinese worried about the fact that the Americans so far aren't acting to implement the consensus reached in San Francisco, to build on that in order to put Sino-US relations on a healthy, stable, and sustainable direction. And the Chinese, again, bringing up the topic of Taiwan, and the Americans apparently either unwilling to discuss that, or at the very least, unwilling to admit that they discussed it in a readout of the conversation. On the single issues that matter most to China, the United States does not want to acknowledge that the Chinese brought them up in talks with the US Secretary of State. At the time of the Philofi summit meeting, I said that I expected that it would lead to a further deterioration of Chinese-US relations. And I suggest, on the evidence of this readout, that we are already seeing the first signs of that. Well, thank you for joining me again for this program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also, of course, go to our shop, find the various amazing things that are there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.